It's the Draft Fellows coming at you live. Kyle and Andrew breaking down the drive. Prospects to roster, we got the flow. First round picks to the ones you don't know. Talk about the combine, skills on display. Who's rising up and who's falling away. Roster building like a GM in the zone. Kyle, Fellows, Andrew Mertig, they own the phone.
Hey, welcome back to the Draft Fellows podcast. I'm Andrew Mertig. That is Kyle Fellows, and together we are the Draft Fellows. Make sure to check our channel out on YouTube or the audio version on your favorite podcasting platform. And if you're just here to listen to the intro and the outro, I get it. They're hits.
They're amazing.
They're great. They're
I forgot about the new intro until you pushed the button, and I immediately started laughing because I love it so much. It's just
my favorite part of this is I can see you, but you can't see me. So I can see myself dancing and you dancing, but no one else can see it.
I can see you. So I saw you dancing.
Oh,
I can see you. See?
This whole time
you didn't know this, but I can see you the whole time. That's awesome. We can.
So we'll jump right into it. But today we are going to do what we did last week and what we plan to do for a lot of the regular season coming up. We're going to talk about 2024 rookies, how they did in week 2 action, and then highlight some of the 2025 prospects that we really like. So let's just get into it with a very easy one. My first selection, wide receiver Marvin Harrison Jr. out of Arizona. We specifically mentioned him in last week's show. And hey, there were a lot of rookies who just had a bad week 1. Probably nobody more so than Marvin Harrison. There were some people questioning his speed. It was really as good as people made him out to be. And then he came out and in 1 quarter of action for Arizona, did the work of any other rookie receiver through their entire first 2 games. And then after the first quarter, Arizona was so far ahead that even though they missed him on 2 goal line fades, which would have been 2 more touchdowns.
Crazy.
But I mean, he was done. Arizona didn't need him anymore. But he ends with 4 catches for 130 yards, 2 touchdowns, almost all of that in the first quarter. Like I mentioned, he could have had even more. So Marvin Harrison, he is what we thought he was, and definitely worth a shout out this week.
Was that a Dennis Green reference there, since we're talking about the Cardinals?
It was inadvertent, but it was close. That worked out really well.
Good. Yeah. No, but okay, this is not a fantasy football podcast, but your buy low window for Marvin Harrison just slammed shut. 1 catch, 4 yards week 1, and then he just goes nuclear. I mean, that just sliver of opportunity that you had to throw an offer to someone to get, the next amazing wide receiver in the NFL is probably gone. So great to see him bounce back and have that kind of a performance. I'm going to talk about someone else that's just kind of lighting the NFL on fire already in this rookie class, and that's Brock Bowers, the tight end for the Las Vegas Raiders. It's not that long ago, Brock Bowers was touted as the best tight end prospect, maybe ever. This guy was up that high on the list. We're talking about him as one of the next greats. And then the draft process happens, right? People saw his receding hairline. They saw him standing next to Gronkowski, and the buzz just kind of started to slow down a little bit even at that point. And then, of course, some of the testing, incomplete things. He gets picked by the Raiders next, right? The dominoes just kept kind of falling for this guy in the wrong direction. Raiders questions with a coaching transition, with offensive philosophy questions. Michael Mayer was the pick last year, right? Is there quarterback questions? So many issues going into this one, and it was just getting harder to see him coming in and dominating the way that they thought that he might kind of continue that trajectory out of Georgia. And he's doing exactly that, right? He's just been phenomenal. 9 catches for 98 yards in week 2, just a target hog for this offense. He looks dominant. The 3rd highest grade tight end for PFF through 2 weeks. Now, obviously small sample size, but off to a phenomenal start and does not look like a rookie tight end. Looks like absolutely someone you could run an offense through. Exactly what we probably should have thought Brock Bowers was going to be, but really cool to see him hitting his stride early in his NFL career.
Yeah, a lot of big swings and misses in dynasty drafts by me taking wide receivers at picks 5 and 6 of rookie drafts. When I should have taken Brock Bowers. But here's what I'll say. So Sam Laporta had probably the best statistic rookie tight end season ever last year. And now he's struggling a little bit. The one thing about Laporta last year was he was very tight end dependent. And he had some long touchdowns. I'm not discrediting Sam Laporta as a great tight end, and I'm sure he's going to bounce back just fine. But Bowers does things differently. And so where I think people were nervous is like we saw the Falcons take Kyle Pitts super high in the draft, and he did have 1,000-yard season in his first year, but since then just really no traction in getting going. And Kyle Pitts is a freak, and so is Brock Bowers, but they're athletic freaks in very different ways. Pitts has like linear speed, and he's super explosive. He's strong. He's big. He's physical. Bowers is more shifty. And I think what we're seeing with him being a target hog is he's maybe more of the Cooper Kupp of tight ends. Right? Pitts is more of the DK Metcalf. And I think there is so much room for Bowers to just be consistently good / great forever. Like I sort of underestimated. I had him graded super, super high in the draft. And I was like, yeah, but like rookie tight ends don't really translate unless they're catching tons of touchdowns. Bowers doesn't need to catch a lot of touchdowns because he's going to find open all the time. He's super smart against zone. He wants to sit down, and that's what makes typically the best tight ends in the league. But he's so shifty against man that linebackers have zero chance against him. So what are you going to do? You're going to bring the corner down and then not cover Devontae Adams? Like, with It's super intriguing. Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. This is a guy I think we're probably going to be talking about a bunch this year.
Yeah, super, super fascinating. He's going to be a lot of fun to watch throughout the season. I think the biggest thing, like you mentioned, Pitts as a contrast, like you almost have to think of those guys in different buckets, right? Like super athlete, you have to think of Pitts as an athlete, whereas like Bowers drops in as a true tight end type, right? Like it's almost like a different, like Pitts is an oversized wide receiver. Bowers comes in and just does a lot of the things that tight ends do in that mold a little bit more naturally. And maybe that helps him adjust. But like, I mean, what you said, like Laporta kind of gave us that taste of like guys can do it. And then you're kind of gun shy. Like, can somebody do it 2 years in a row? Like, what are the odds? And it looks like maybe already we're off to a path that would have that happening for Brock Bowers. But you've got an offensive tackle, which, I mean, we try to make sure that we don't just highlight, the fantasy football studs. Who's the offensive tackle of the week here?
Yeah, we're going to go with Taliese Fuaga out of New Orleans. And obviously the Saints are the story of the early NFL season. No one saw this explosion coming from their offense. Nobody saw, maybe somebody saw a 2-0 start, but not in the fashion that they have won.
Right.
And so, of course, this offense going nuclear has a lot to do with the new offensive coordinator. It has a lot to do with Derek Carr playing better. But this offensive line has been fantastic, and Fuaga is a huge part of that. He's been really strong in both the run and pass grade. He's the 21st graded offensive tackle by Pro Football Focus. Take PFF for what it's worth. If you like it or if you don't like it, he's been really, really, really strong. And I think for a rookie to step in and be that good right away is amazing. And I want to give Fuaga all of the credit because he is an integral part of this Saints offense taking off the way that it has.
Yeah, absolutely. He was one of my favorite tackles. There were so many good tackles in this class. I think it was easy to overlook kind of who was maybe offensive tackle 3, 4 down the list because you talked about the guys kind of at the top. But in any other class, this is a guy who probably goes higher than he did. And it looks like he's playing to meet those kind of expectations early in his career as well. Kamari Lassiter, the corner for the Houston Texans, is the one I want to talk about here. This is a bit of a victory lap for me, my cornerback 5 in the draft process this past spring, ahead of guys like Nate Wiggins. So I really, really liked Kamari Lassiter. Really nice interception against Caleb Williams in week 2, the 4th highest graded cornerback for PFF, as Andrew said, take it for what it's worth, but 4th highest through 2 weeks for PFF. He's just a great all-around player. That's what I loved about him coming out, was really well-rounded, can play inside, can play outside. a light frame, but plays more physical than that frame. He can be a little bit grabby at times, which was one of the things that you were concerned about coming out. We haven't seen that a ton thus far. Seems like he's cleaning that up. One of the biggest knocks was like he didn't produce a lot of ball production, but he was a pass breakup king. And like he always plays around the ball. So we don't, he had the interception in week 2, making plays. Sometimes that just, maybe it's just opportunities. Maybe it's just like, they make the most of those opportunities. And it's just kind of like the chance of it, right? That they weren't able to complete those plays in the college games. But this is a player who was incredibly versatile in college and had that inside-outside versatility, which I think usually translates really well. And through 2 weeks, it certainly looks like Lassiter is off to a great start.
Yeah, and I did not like Lassiter coming out. You and I, that was one of our biggest disagreements in last draft cycle. So nice that you get to spike the ball on me. And I will say, like, it's even more impressive what Lassiter is doing because opposite Derek Stingley, he's going to get all the targets, right?
Mm-hmm.
When quarterbacks are trying to target wide
yeah.
receivers, they're not going after Stingley. So really, really impressive what he's been able to put on tape. Awesome game on Sunday night. As well. And now we're going to transition over to our 2025 draft prospects. And this one is a pick because I just saw him completely one-man show, tear apart my Wisconsin Badgers. And that is Alabama quarterback Jalen Milroe. Through 3 games, he is completing over 67% of his passes. He has 590 yards, which isn't all that impressive in 3 games, but 8 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. And oh, by the way, added another 156 yards rushing with 6 more TDs. This is what I wrote about him. Based on the tape coming into the season, he has a cannon for an arm that obviously hasn't changed. He can hit throws on any level of the field. He's also a very explosive runner. He makes plays where they just simply don't exist. Prior to the season, I thought there's a processing issue here. He can struggle to identify blitzes, read through progressions, make decisive plays. That stuff can be developed, but this is a really important year to move from a tools player to a complete quarterback. And that's why I wanted to highlight Milroe this week, because I got a chance to watch him live and, again, review the game a little bit. And I have seen progression in those areas. I think he's processing the game better. I think it's slowing down for him a little bit. He's making better decisions. He obviously has that ability to pull it down and run. And what he's doing now is he's using his feet to either extend the play and throw or extend the play and run when it's breaking down, and he's not making those big mistakes. So we'll see how this goes when he transitions into the SEC football, which probably will give him more of a challenge than the Badgers defense did. But I think, there's a lot to be really optimistic about Milroe. And I think this is a guy who could be a really big riser come draft season. There's always the chance that as an underclassman, he stays at Alabama. We know NIL money is going to be significant. So if he doesn't feel like he's a lock as a first-round pick, maybe he comes back. But I know a lot of people like to compare him to Lamar Jackson. But to me, what I see is like early Houston Texans Deshaun Watson. I think he is good enough as a passer for that to stand alone and be a skill set to be evaluated. He's not just a runner. And I mean, I'm talking about as a prospect. Lamar Jackson was seen as a runner who happens to be able to throw. Deshaun Watson was seen as a passer who could run. And I really think Milroe can get to that place. He's an electric athlete, but I think as a quarterback, as he settles in and develops, this is a guy that I could see, especially in the modern NFL, being, a top 10 pick or, maybe a middle of the first round where he goes into a really great situation and can excel. So loved what I saw from Jalen.
Yeah, so in draft circles, people always talk about don't scout the helmet, scout the player. And I will admit that Alabama quarterbacks is one of the hardest ones for me to shake, just because it feels like we've had so many lately where they're so good at doing what Nick Saban, and now post Nick Saban, it's a different thing, but like what he's asked them to do. And they're surrounded by incredible NFL talent at wide receiver, and the offensive line is always like, which offensive tackle is going to go in the first round that's an Alabama player. They're just churning through talent. And so I always have a hard time, but this might be the one that flips that, right? Because of the talent that's here. So it'll be really interesting to see what his stock does, what he's able to sustain over this year. Like you said, if he comes out, but if he can kind of be that next one to kind of maybe shake that stigma of what's been a little bit of a bumpy road for some Alabama players making the move to the NFL. The guy I want to talk about is Tetairoa McMillan, or they call him T-Mac often, from Arizona. And he went off against Kansas State for 11 catches for 138 yards. This is not my usual cup of tea at the wide receiver position. I kind of like not small receivers, but like a little bit more agile route runners typically than maybe what he profiles at. But he's just like a huge player, 6'5", 210 pounds, and you consistently see that length on display. Such a big target. Like this guy just has the longest arms that allows him to be open all the time. The strike zone is just so big. He's not going to win vertically. I don't even think in college that's really his game. I don't think in the NFL he's going to win vertically a lot. But because of his size and the target that he allows your quarterback, I think that's an asset that's going to be absolutely a strength of his coming into the league when he does decide to come out. He's going to win on crossers, comebacks, jump balls, and contribute to an offense in that way. A lot of people see this guy sneaking into the first round. I didn't see him in that light until this game, and I do think that he did a lot in this performance to show what he can bring to the offense as somebody who can just gobble up targets and be that quarterback's best friend kind of a player. I don't know if he's going to make it into that first round conversation, but he has a whole year of football in front of him to kind of write that narrative if he wants to get there.
Yeah, I think after his week 1 performance, there were legit mock drafts from people I respect and like their work that had him in the top 10. So yeah. I think that's a stratosphere I was not expecting. When I took a look at him, I saw almost exactly the same player as you. The size and catch radius you would absolutely dream about. I thought he was really good in space, has actual quickness that allows him to play in various positions. I think he could be a big slot. He's really, really hard to beat at the catch point, a surprisingly good route runner. I just questioned his deep speed. And, if he can't separate, do dominant catch point guys succeed in the NFL? And the note that I wrote at the end is like, is he Mike Evans? Is he Alan Lazard? We don't know. And there is a happy middle ground there, right? Like there's the Keon Colemans of the world who are borderline first round picks.
Right.
That can find really, really nice roles. There's the Michael Pittmans of the world. I think McMillan can like easily settle into that. It's just when he goes through, maybe the all-star circuit, and I think especially the testing, that's going to tell, is this guy truly a top 10 pick, or is he maybe more like that end of the first, early second kind of player? Yeah,
I think that's really fair. I'm glad you brought up those comps because like Alan Lazard, I think, is a really good example. Maybe Alan Lazard does not have the pedigree of this player as far as what people are saying about him right now. But Mike Evans is such a unicorn. And that was the one that came to my mind, is like the guy who's 6'5" and it just has that massive frame, who's a dominant player in the NFL. There's just not that many of them that are like that size, that profile, who move the way that Mike Evans does. And obviously Mike wins in a lot of ways that other guys don't, as far as like he wins vertically, even though he's not maybe the fastest guy in the world at this point in his career. But yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how he continues to perform on Saturdays, to see if he can convince the NFL that this is a player who can separate enough at the NFL level. I will say high pointing the ball is something that's like kind of written into his profile, as far as something he kind of basket catches a little bit sometimes. And he like, there was one time on the broadcast where like the announcer was like, oh, and he like high pointed that ball so well. And I'm like, he might have jumped, but like the ball like hit him in the chest and he caught it like this. And I'm like, the ball high pointing is like, when you go up and get it above the corner, so I think if he can perfect that trait of actually being able to maximize not only what his natural wingspan is, but like accentuate that by like catching it at its highest point, that's what would separate him from like a lot of other guys who just don't have those physical tools. But yeah, I wasn't super interested in him before this last week, but now I'm kind of like, I'm curious because I'm like, there's a lot here to really like about the player.
Yeah, I think he's super fascinating. That's going to be a name to watch in a wide receiver class that has some interesting names, just maybe not the super high profile guy yet. And then last week, this was inspired by our conversation about the reemergence of Jameson Williams. So, we're all about roster building in the draft, and the draft doesn't necessarily end when a player is a rookie. We can go into the second years, and sometimes players emerge in like their third season, like Jameson Williams, and then sometimes we see players sort of drop off the edge of the cliff, and that is certainly what has happened in Carolina. So we have Bryce Young's struggles leading to him getting benched, and just wanted to talk to a little bit about that, because I think there's lots of lessons to be learned here. I was not necessarily very high on Bryce Young. He was not my QB1. Anthony Richardson was, in fact. So that's an entirely different prospect to consider. But for Young, is it just the NFL and people that are taking a look at draft prospects were evaluating the wrong stuff? Is it simply that the situation failed Bryce Young more than he failed the situation? Combination of all of the above? Like, what do you think?
I mean, I think it's really a fascinating and a sad situation, I think, because I feel for Bryce Young that, like, no matter what his failings are, there's no doubt that the Carolina Panthers are not a quarterback away from contending. Like, this is a team that needs so much right now. It's just hard to evaluate, like, what was on Bryce, what was on the coaching staff, how much is ownership just have their hands too much in decisions, like how much pressure is like Dave Canellis already feeling to like get things moving. Like, even though like obviously a young quarterback takes time, I don't know that David Tepper has time to wait. Like, I don't know if he feels like he has time to wait. So what are all those dynamics that built into this? It's really going to be interesting to see what they do going forward. Obviously, they've made the decision to go with Andy Dalton, but like, is Bryce done there? It feels like, I mean, they're saying they still think that he can be a franchise quarterback in the NFL. These are all the same things that the New York Jets said when Zach Wilson kind of started his downward spiral there. And so it's interesting. Like, we did our series a few weeks ago where we talked about the teams in the NFL that could be looking for a quarterback in 2025 and like that draft class. And it was funny. We got into this conversation and we kind of kicked things off with like, I think you said things would have to go so incredibly poorly for year 3 Bryce Young contract to not be the quarterback there. We kind of said like, okay, maybe that's his last like audition, right? Like 2025 might be his last go if things are not better. But like, I mean, 2 weeks, man, like this was not a sample size that I think anyone would have predicted that they would have said, we have enough to go on here to really move. And I think there's a lot of factors to unpack to why they made that decision.
It's just organizational dysfunction to me. You feel for Bryce, and certainly like this is on him. He's a adult. He's making a lot of money, and at the end of the day, you have to produce. But the situation is, he comes in, he gets thrown in the starting lineup with a like absolute lack of talent around him all of last season. Head coach doesn't even make it through his first year on the job. Yeah. And then they're moving on. It's a new regime. They come in, and then for all the praise Dave Canellis got for last year and what he did in Seattle, why didn't Bryce Young play in the preseason? Like, it's a new system. This is a guy who's incredibly raw. You're surrounding him with new weapons in Deontay Johnson and Xavier Legette and like Jatavian Sanders and all these players. Like, why didn't he play in the preseason? Because you would have figured out some of these things. Maybe he could have gotten some confidence by completing things against second, third stringers. You start to move along. Like, you were concerned about injuries, but there's not really like any expectations on the Panthers this year. So I don't understand that. I don't think that was a good move. I think now that you've benched him, the Bryce Young experience in Carolina is done unless Andy Dalton gets hurt. And I don't know how you go back to him. And quite frankly, if I'm the Panthers, I probably am looking to move on from him. I think Bryce Young, he's absolutely going to get more chances because every quarterback who's picked
every first round pick does.
Chances.
Yeah.
But I would love to see him go somewhere. And, I know people have been talking about Baker Mayfield. They've been talking about Sam Darnold because of their experience in Carolina. I would just like to see him go somewhere where he can sit for a year. I mentioned today on Twitter, like, I think the LA Rams are a really intriguing possibility.
Yeah.
Where, like, potentially they could trade like a late round pick this year, grab him. Carolina doesn't have to deal with the distraction. He doesn't even suit up for them. Like, he's the emergency quarterback at best because Jimmy G is going to come back from the suspension. They have Stafford, they have Jimmy G. Bryce Young just sits there and learns from McVay, Mike LaFleur, and that whole staff. And then maybe next year Stafford retires and Bryce Young is given an opportunity in the season, or maybe he comes in and he's the backup. But within that offense, the way that McVay schemes things, the way that the weapons that they have, I think that is a place where he could be really successful versus, like, I know people talked about the New York Giants, which I think is just disaster waiting to happen. Cause like, who's going to succeed in that situation? So I like the idea, you know, I would have thrown out a team like Green Bay in the past. But you know, with Malik Willis, that's not going to happen. You know, maybe a San Francisco is an interesting option. Because he could do kind of the same thing as with the Rams, but just like let this guy learn for a year, let him settle back down, let him regain his confidence. And you know, he was a Tua-like quarterback coming out in college, and I think he just needs to be in an offense where he can be a distributor instead of having so much pressure on him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we all hope that like Tua's career continues with health and like, but like Miami's another team that like I could see that's like built to win and like you know, like there's a lot of dominoes to fall here. I don't know what they could get for him at this point or what do they need to move him like in the next calendar year to, you know, help out the locker room, those kinds of things. We'll see. But there's so many things. It's so funny because I texted my friend the exact same thing when this happened. I said 2026 starting quarterback for the LA Rams, like just because the Stafford timeline makes sense. The McVay, you know, he's going to get good performance out of his quarterbacks. And so, and again, just like a way better organization. They know what they're doing. I hate all of this for Dave Canellis, who comes over from Tampa, has a ton of success there. And the expectations are sky high of like fixing the quarterback that they just drafted. And maybe David like Canellis thinks like, I already know, and I'm done. We just need to move on. Like, but I'm just like what doesn't make sense to me is that like this team is not going to win this year. Like Andy Dalton is not going to get them to the promised land. Like at this point in his career, they knew that Bryce Young was horrible right now. Like he may not be horrible forever, but they knew he was horrible. Let him lose. Like lose with Bryce Young and figure out if something gets fixed. Like think about this is not the same scenario, but think about the Green Bay Packers for us with Jordan Love for the first few weeks of the season last year, and what happened at the end of the season. You know, he was not Bryce Young bad at the beginning of the season, but things changed drastically at the end of the year. If you let it play out and you find out what you have, worst case scenario is you get the number 1 pick. Like, just let that happen, because now what are you going to do? Like, you're going to have a head coach who's super frustrated, no plan because Andy Dalton is not a long-term answer, and maybe you win yourself into the teens or like out of range for a top quarterback. Like, it just doesn't make any sense to me, and I think it screams impatience from the organization, and I hate it for everybody involved. But not what we expected in week 2, but here we are with Andy Dalton as a starting quarterback in the NFL.
Yeah, I think the counter to that is for Dave Canellis, this is his chance to be a head coach, and he's saying, I can't go in and go, 1-16. And they have to evaluate the other young players that are on this team. And Bryce Young was so over the top bad that they weren't even allowed to properly evaluate those players. But that being said, you had to have seen this coming at some point, right?
Yeah.
Like through OTAs and training camp and preseason, like, again, that goes back to like, why weren't you playing him in preseason? And if he truly was that bad, why is he starting the year at all? I know that there's so much sunk cost because he wasn't just the number 1 pick. He was the number 1 pick plus all of the other assets that Carolina traded, right? Like it's DJ Moore. It's the number 1 overall pick in this year's class, the second rounders. So I get it. Like, you have to give this guy more than a year, but a year and 2 games does nothing. So like,
either
make the decision to pull him because he's not ready, and then at least don't shatter his confidence completely, or stick with him for a little bit longer. I don't know. This is a bad situation. Bryce didn't do what he needed to do, but I think the Carolina Panthers are much more to blame than Bryce Young is.
It would be very hard to be a fan of that organization right now, just knowing that like you are years away from like all of it. I mean, teams get flipped all the time and you're like, wow, that happened faster than we thought. But like the reality is you're probably 3 years away from like even being able to dream of, a winning season or anything like that in the near future. But hate it for Bryce, hate it for this team and the fan base, but it'll be interesting to see what happens with the Panthers this year. Lots of fun. They get Jonathan Brooks back in a couple weeks, and maybe things change and those guys start playing. Like we'll see what happens. But fun conversation. Thanks for joining us today on the show. Make sure you like and subscribe to the show. From the draft room to the gridiron, the Draft Fellows have you covered. Until next time, stay tuned and stay in the game.
Kyle got the insight, Andrew brings the heat. Breaking down the roster every single week. Catch us on the podcast, we coming through your speakers. Top picks for practice squad, we got the seekers. Team dynamics, contracts, and the trades. From the draft day excitement to the accolades. Draft fellows on the track, we gone strong. Analyze the plays, we can't be wrong. From the 40-yard dash to the longest throw. We talking pro ball, yeah,